This is lesson 19.6, the French Revolution, Politics and Religion in 1790, 1791 also. We are halfway done with the French Revolution. And when I say French Revolution and I say halfway done, I mean we're halfway done with the first of 4 phases of the French Revolution. But don't worry, the other 3 phases won't get anything close to the kind of attention and detail that this first critical phase is getting. This, what we call the liberal phase. Same question as before. How did the events of 1789 result in a constitutional monarchy in France, and what were the consequences? We need to be flexible with that year 1789 because we're actually stretching into 1790, 1791, 1792. Same topic, 5.4, explain the causes, events, and consequences of the French Revolution. And we've got these 3 paragraphs right here that tell us what's important to College Board. French Revolution resulted from a combination of long-term social and political causes as well as Enlightenment ideas exacerbated by short-term fiscal and economic crises. The first, or liberal phase, that's our phase, of the French Revolution established a constitutional monarchy, increased popular participation, nationalized the Catholic Church, and abolished hereditary privileges. And women enthusiastically participated in the early phases of the revolution. However, while there were brief improvements in the legal status of women, citizenship in the Republic was soon restricted to men. Time frame about 1790. Let's stretch that 1791. And look at this picture. Oh my, look at how violent they're getting with this poor priest. That's the name of our lesson, Politics and Religion. Once again, I need to say that I have used many different sources for these lessons on the French Revolution, but I want to give special recognition to the great courses audiobook, Living the French Revolution in the Age of Napoleon by Professor Suzanne Desan. You can listen to this book from audible.com. It's well worth it. Learning how to do democratic politics when you've never done it before. That's what we're talking about. In 1790, the National Assembly began to rapidly introduce changes into every imaginable aspect of French life. When you're trying to take away a hierarchy and you're trying to take away privilege, and those things permeate everything in French life, then that's what you're going to have to do. How can the following be made more rational, more efficient, more scientific, and more modern? These things: religion, taxes, marriage, love, education, family life, etc. France was also cobbled together out of about 30 very diverse provinces. They had different languages, they had different taxes, they had different law codes. The French language had not spread through all of these provinces yet. And how could the National Assembly make all of this into one single nation of individuals? And how do you invent citizenship? How do you decide who the citizens are? Then you have to put everything up for a vote. The new politics had began to divide France. Some were happy about this situation. Others had lost everything. The National Assembly felt that power should rest in the hands of ordinary citizens, and they converted France's 30 or so provinces into 83 what are called departments. They were made very carefully. They were all roughly the same size. They were all within a day's walk from the capital of that department. Many provinces lost their tax advantages in this new restructuring. Many royal judges and officials lost their jobs. Many of those who lost their positions campaigned to be elected to the offices that they had previously been appointed to and lost. The National Assembly outlawed torture, and they replaced those old seigneurial courts run by local nobles, with elected justices of the peace. And the National Assembly guaranteed a trial by jury in criminal cases. And they replaced the king's bureaucracy all over France with new men elected by qualified citizens. And just about every position you could think of was up for election during this time, including bishops and priests, including military officers. Who should be allowed to vote? Men who paid a certain amount of taxes, property owners? Should there be universal male suffrage? Deputy Maximilian Robespierre argued that a man was a citizen by nature. All a man needed to be a citizen was two things: sound judgment and a patriotic heart. The National Assembly decided that there would be, quote, active citizens and, quote, passive citizens. And active citizens could vote. Active citizens paid taxes equivalent to 3 days' wages. Slightly higher taxes made you eligible to run for local offices, and much higher taxes made you eligible to be a deputy in the National Assembly. Some people pointed out that under these current rules, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a guiding light of the French Revolution, would not have been allowed to be a deputy in the National Assembly. He wouldn't have paid enough taxes. Under this system, all women and about 40% of adult men were excluded from being able to vote. By 1792, the franchise was widened to include all men over 21 except for servants, slaves, and vagabonds. There were many other voting concerns. There was always the fear that old regime men would get elected to offices in large numbers and then attempt to roll back the clock on the revolution. Another concern was travel. Sometimes you had to travel 1 to 4 days to vote in the national elections. Nobody ever voted before, so it was a steep learning curve for everyone. Over the course of the French Revolution, an astonishing approximately 1 million men were elected to some kind of political office out of a country of only 28 million people. Then there were the all-important political clubs. These were popular all over France. The Jacobins were a great example. We studied them. By 1792, there was a national network of about 1,500 local Jacobin societies throughout France. Women formed political clubs, even though they couldn't vote. They found other ways to be involved and have a voice. Teenagers and youth groups formed political clubs. Political clubs met anywhere they could: churches, monasteries, granaries, Masonic lodges, etc. What did a typical political club space look like? If you walked into a political club, what might you see? Well, there might be a rostrum for speakers. They would decorate with some paintings or busts of people like Voltaire or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or even Louis XVI. They would perhaps have a map of France. They might hang a copy of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And what activities did these political clubs engage in? They elected officers, they wrote bylaws, they kept agendas and minutes, they helped with local elections, they gave lots of speeches, they organized festivals and banquets, they sang revolutionary and patriotic songs, they corresponded with their mother societies in Paris, they corresponded with societies in England. England was much further along with their political clubs. They commemorated the passing of revolutionary leaders. They petitioned the National Assembly about all kinds of issues and causes. And they read tons and tons of newspaper articles and editorials together. In fact, they often timed their meetings with the arrival of the newspapers. So what's the point of all of this detail about political clubs in the French Revolution? Well, it helps us remember three things. There were three pillars of democratic revolutionary politics. The first was the press, the second one was elections, and the third was political clubs. It was through their mass participation in all of these political clubs that ordinary French people were getting a crash course in democratic politics on a massive scale. All of this political activity was dividing France deeply. You had the old traditional way of life versus the new system that distributed power and resources more widely than before. And it was clear that the French Revolution was going to mean big losses in status and power for the old elites of society. The revolution was also going to impact some people economically. For example, many nobles left the country and became known as émigrés. Many other nobles became less showy in their dress and their tastes, and this caused high unemployment in the luxury trades: wigs, lace, shoes, even fencing lessons. If you give fencing lessons to the children of nobility, now you've lost your income. The conservative monarchists, the Monarchian, formed their own club within the National Assembly to compete with that liberal left-wing Jacobin Club. And they believed in a constitutional monarchy, just like the Jacobins did. But they also wanted to put the skids on the French Revolution. They wanted a more authoritarian government. They didn't believe that ordinary citizens had the aptitude to govern themselves, and they wanted to keep the monarchy sacred. They wanted to protect the power of the elites. But they also wanted to attract popular support for themselves, like the Jacobins did. And so these monarchists also formed a large network of monarchist clubs. And sometimes Jacobins and monarchists had unpleasant confrontations throughout France that occasionally even became violent. The French Revolution and the Catholic Church. When you study the French Revolution, you hear a lot about the interaction between the National Assembly and the Church. Things like electing priests to their positions, making priests take oaths of loyalty to the state, nationalizing church property. What was that all about? What did it look like? What was the fallout? I'm going to try to answer that for you, because this whole church thing, when we talk about the French Revolution, can be really hazy and difficult to comprehend. First, if you were a revolutionary leader in France in 1789 and 1791, and you were trying to abolish feudalism, get rid of privilege and hierarchy, establish natural and universal rights, create a political democracy, then you're going to have to mess with the church. The church clergy was, after all, the first estate, and it was inseparable from old regime privilege. It was the second wealthiest and second most powerful institution in France, the first being the monarchy. Social hierarchy was taught in the church, and the church owned 6 to 10% of all the land in France, and peasants worked on those church lands under the exact same conditions as peasants working for feudal lords. If the nation was now sovereign, then logic dictated that a national church should be created. But the National Assembly was also messing with something that was very dangerous to mess with. Think about these factors. Unlike the nobility, the Catholic Church advanced spiritual beliefs that provided hope and comfort to people. People ordered their lives around the rituals, the holy days, and the seasons of the church. The parish church was the center of every town. Paris alone had 50 churches and 100 monasteries. The parish priest was often the most respected man in the village. And he was there for all the big turning points in daily life: marriages, baptisms, funerals, etc. The priest kept public records of all these events. And he kept people informed, reading newspapers from the pulpit. And the priest sometimes practiced medicine for the community. The church was where the National Assembly made their most crucial errors. Their actions with the church divided France still further along pro- and anti-revolutionary lines. On July 14, 1790, the one-year anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, all of France celebrated with the Festival of Federation. Even the king and queen took part in the celebrations, and there were parades and spectators, and in Paris, the people built a huge amphitheater just for the occasion. All over France, a Catholic Mass was given as part of these revolutionary festivities. In Paris, the bishop who presided over the Mass, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, wore garments of the revolutionary colors, red, white, and blue. The celebration was jubilant and optimistic, and at exactly 12 noon, all over France, people simultaneously paused the celebration to recite the oath of loyalty to the nation. And the people believed that the French Revolution had God's own blessing. But religious practice had been on the decline over the 18th century in France, especially in the cities, especially among the urban elites and the middle class, the bourgeoisie. How do you measure a feeling like religious enthusiasm anyway, if you're a historian? Well, they look at things like this, data such as fewer people were becoming monks and nuns and priests. Sales of religious books were in decline. The Enlightenment itself was deeply anti-clerical. Enlightenment philosophers criticized the church from three different angles: superstition, wealth, and usefulness to society. Most Enlightenment philosophers were not outright atheists. They tended to target aspects of religious practice and beliefs that they saw as being particularly superstitious. In Lesson 16.3, we mentioned that Montesquieu had written the Persian Letters in 1721. And in this book, Montesquieu described the king as a, quote, magician. And then Montesquieu attacked the Pope, saying this, quote, "There is another magician even stronger than he, called the Pope. He can make the king believe that three are only one, or else that bread is not bread, or that wine is not wine, and 1,000 other things of the same kind." Of course, Montesquieu was talking here about the Trinity and transubstantiation. And in Lesson 11.4 of the summer reading, we talked about how John Wycliffe rejected transubstantiation, and we also talked about how transubstantiation was debated in Lessons 13.1 and 13.4. So this issue is not new to us. Enlightenment philosophers often criticize the Catholic Church for its wealth. Monks, as we have talked about, were highly criticized. They owned a lot, they ate a lot, they drank a lot, but they didn't seem to do a lot. And many priests felt the same way about these monks. And Enlightenment philosophers argued that if the church was going to thrive in society, it should do two things: serve society and be useful. Revolutionaries agreed with the Enlightenment philosophers about the church. The church should serve society. It should stop monopolizing wealth and privilege. And it should serve the revolution with its new politics. Let's nationalize the church. In other words, have the government run it. Let's enlist the clergy's help with the revolution. And remember two important things about our good friends in the National Assembly. Number one, they had already passed a resolution declaring that church tithes should end. And number two, they had also assumed the responsibility for the nation's massive debt. So if the church was so wealthy, and if the church should work for the public good, what if the nation nationalized the church and sold its lands to pay off that debt? You would have two problems fixed with one big move. Guess who proposed a plan to nationalize the Catholic Church in France? A Catholic bishop, namely Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand. He was the very same bishop who conducted the Mass in a tricolor robe at the Festival of Federation on the anniversary of the Bastille in Paris. Some called him a minister of Satan for making such a proposal. But Talleyrand's proposal passed. Massive amounts of church property were put up for sale. Proceeds from the sale even backed a new currency system, the assignat. Lots of well-off peasants bought up this church land, and lots of urban bourgeoisie bought it also. There's a picture of the assignat, a new church property-backed money with Louis XVI's face right up in front. This changing hands of church property was good for the revolution. If you bought some of this nationalized church land, the last thing you wanted was for the revolution to fail. This might mean you would have to give that land back. Then you'd lose your entire investment. So now you've got a stake in the revolution. So what happened to all of the monks and the nuns? These people were now set free from their vows. The National Assembly abolished monastic vows and urged monks and nuns to return to secular life. Exceptions were made for those who did useful things like healing and teaching. Many monks were happy about it. Many had never really wanted to take monastic vows of celibacy, etc. But many nuns had a much harder time finding another job. The creation of the National Church. The National Assembly passed an act in June 1790 called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And under this act, the state now paid priests' salaries. Priests became civil servants just like any other civil servant. For most priests, this actually meant a raise. For most bishops, it meant a pay cut. Maximilian Robespierre even proposed an end to the vow of celibacy that priests had to take. National Assembly wasn't quite ready for that yet. Under the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, active citizens could now vote for and elect their priests. Even Protestants and Jews would get to vote on who the local Catholic priest would be. But the National Assembly's biggest mistake of the early revolution was the loyalty oath. Under the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, priests were required to take an oath of loyalty to the nation, the law, and the king. It might seem crazy for us, for a man of God to have to do such a thing. But other civil servants were required to take a loyalty oath, and since priests were now civil servants, why shouldn't they do the same? The king reluctantly agreed to the Civil Constitution of the Clergy and to the loyalty oath for priests. The Pope, after some time, condemned the loyalty oath. The loyalty oath was a tough decision for priests. A little more than half of priests took the oath. Only 7 bishops took it. Priests were allowed to specify qualifications when they took the oath. In fact, one priest wrote 30 pages of qualifications when he took his oath. If you were a priest who took the oath, then you were called a juror priest, or you could also be called a constitutional priest. These priests tended to see themselves as servants of the people and as citizen priests. If you refused to take the oath, then you were called a non-juror priest, or you were also called a refractory priest. These priests tended to see themselves as servants of God rather than of the state. France was severely divided by the oath of loyalty for priests. Some saw the oath as an assault on their communities and traditions and beliefs. Others believed that non-juror priests were counter-revolutionaries, enemies. Some of the more conservative parishes were against their priests taking the oath. And if a priest took the oath, he was considered a heretic in these conservative parishes. He was no longer respected. Some even threw stones at him. Some more patriotic, more revolutionary parishes were in favor of the oath. Some physically attacked their priests who refused to take the oath. Many priests left their parishes rather than take the oath. In conservative parishes with non-juror priests, a new constitutional priest would have to be found by the state, and these parishes were often hostile to the new guy. Sometimes in these conservative parishes, the old priest who had refused to take the oath shared the church with the new priest. And this created even more confusion and uncertainty among the people. Some non-juror priests held masses and gave sacraments in secret. Previously in this lesson, we described the religious elements of the one-year anniversary celebration of the storming of the Bastille, the Federation Day Festival on July 14th, 1790. Well, 1 year later, on July 14th, 1791, there was another festival for the 2-year anniversary of Bastille Day. Voltaire's body was brought to a new revolutionary memorial. There was a big parade, big celebration. The entire program of celebration that day contained not one single religious element. No mass, no priests, no references to God at all. Totally secular. That is how much France had changed in just 1 year. France was already on its way to inventing a secular culture, revolutionary festivals, revolutionary beliefs. These were all going to be devoid of religious significance.